welcome to Movies, Films, and Flicks. I am Mark Hacksaw Hoffmeyer, and joining me is John Buzzsaw Levingood.
I appreciate that. I'll take a grinder.
How you doing, man?
Good, man. I kind of imagine like if I had like a big heavy grinder saw, even though it's not big and long, it's like bulky, so it'll look menacing when like a big dude waves that around. And I imagine I might fight Nick Cage with it when he has a chainsaw with it.
Oh, a buzzsaw versus chainsaw fight?
Like a little
gosh.
Mandy flashback.
Oh, yeah. That'd be beautiful. And I gotta tell you, I remember back in 2017, I was writing an article for Rotten Tomatoes called Saw Movies Do Better When There's a Saw Involved. And I called you up and I was like, John, we gotta talk about this franchise because I was doing a rewatch and you were reviewing all the movies for Movies, Films, and Flicks. So they were fresh on your memory.
Right.
And I just, that was the first time in 2017, and I got a question for you soon, but the first time in 2017 when I kind of just went, these movies make sense, because you watch one, I'd watched them in one in 2004, one in 2005, one in 2006, one in 2007, and I think I skipped a couple, then I rented them, so I watched them in order, but I've never watched them back to back. Mm-hmm. So when I watched them back to back, a light went off, and then I called you, and they're like, yeah, man, like, the Saw franchise is actually it's convoluted, but it makes sense it makes sense, this franchise. There's a couple in and outs here that people, outliers, I guess, but when did the Saw franchise start making sense to you? When did you go, this is connected?
You know, this is interesting, because this actually reminds me of when we did our Resident Evil franchise review, right? Whereas originally we thought they were a little choppy and they were all kind of like one shots that picked up after the other. But then when we were watching them in close succession, we realized how much richer and interlocked they really were, more than just picking up from the last one. And so it's funny, our movie watching behaviors, right? Especially when things don't come straight to streaming, like, or HBO 2 or 3 months after they leave theaters. When this stuff started, you were still waiting a year to buy a Blu-ray after it left theaters, unless it was in theaters for a really, really long time. And you might not see Saw 1 on HBO until after Saw 2 came out in theaters.
Yeah.
You know, depending on the timing of things year by year. So, like you, I saw Saw, and eventually Saw 2 came out, and I probably saw 2 before I rewatched Saw 1. Saw 3 probably came out, and by then Saw 1 is probably on HBO, so I'm watching that. Saw 4 comes out, and I think at that point it might be 4 movies in as many years, like back to back to back years. And, you know, you might have watched the first Saw movie, getting up to it. You tell yourself you're going to watch all 3, but you just watch 1 or 2 of them. You don't watch them all. So you didn't watch part 3 before part 4 came out. But since, what is it? I think it is part 4 shows us that its ending simultaneously ends with part 3. And so it's at that point that I sat back and said, holy crap. And then as soon as part 3 became available to watch, I watched part 3 and then part 4. But at some point, now I've seen part 1 and 2 more times than these, I start realizing they're connected. Right? Of course, you know, eventually part 6 comes out. You don't always have time to rewatch everything, but you at least rewatch the movie before to keep it fresh. So for me, it really took a lot of beating over the head to realize they weren't just continuing where the other left off. And, well, 1 and 2 is just that, right? 3 is where they start to give you more Easter eggs. But it was 5 for me. 5 was as Kevin Spacey said in 7, sometimes you have to hit them over the head with a hammer. And that's when I really noticed it. Like, was that? I mean, where was it for you?
So when
4. The end of 4 made it clear to me.
Oh, so when I realized everything was connected?
Yeah, like super connected, yeah. Like more than just continuing.
I remember seeing the end of 4 and seeing Riggs doing exactly what he shouldn't do. Because Jigsaw says, hey, just let these people deal with this, and they'll be fine. And Riggs is like, no! And Art gets killed. Eric Matthews gets killed. But I remember seeing the end of 4, and I just got confused. I'm like, why is Jeff still walking around? Of course, I didn't say Jeff. I'm like, why is the dude from Braveheart still walking around?
Angus McFadden.
Yeah, why is Angus McFadden still walking around? And then they get to 5, and then I'm like, oh, Hoffman. is this? And then, okay. But then but then you have another game that's in it. And you're like, oh, okay. I guess that sort of makes sense. And then you have 6 with the insurance company, and then 7 Saw 3D. When you learn about Hoffman being the apprentice in 5, that goes back. I think it wasn't until about 5 where I went, oh, this like there's multiple layers here. But I'm telling you, John. So by the time this gets released, I wrote a video for the Film Theorists. If you go YouTube, type in Film Theory Mark Hoffmeyer, you'll watch it. And we're not going to cover the same territory in that. I don't want to cannibalize it. But for me, this is more about. I was just looking at it, and I'm just thinking, okay, so you have apprentices, you have accomplices, then you have flashbacks, and then you have stories that are taking place at the same time. And then I started looking at who directed this. So Saw 1 was James Wan. Saw 2 and 3 was Darren Lynn Bousman. Saw 4, actually, 4, Bousman did that as well. Bousman did 2, 3, and 4. 5 was David Hackle, who was the production designer for the Saw movies. And then you had Kevin Grugart, who was the editor for the Saw movies. But then you jumped over to the Spearigs for Jigsaw, but Daybreakers is badass, and so is Predestination. And then you have Spiral coming out with Bousman. So it's a tight-knit family. The people that stick on these movies and make it. You have production designers directing. You have editors directing. Lee Wanell stepped out after the 3rd one, so then his guidance wasn't there. But the more you watch this, Jigsaw's ideology, he's horribly wrong. I mean, this is a guy who says, I was married, my wife lost her baby, then I had a cancer diagnosis, then I had a frontal lobe tumor, so I tried to commit suicide, and I lived, and I realized that people appreciate life more if they live. So then he starts setting up traps all the way back in the day with Logan, going back to Jigsaw. But what's interesting is he'll have accomplices like Zepp and Saw kidnap Dr. Lawrence Gordon's wife and child. And he's like, kill them if Gordon does not succeed in his mission. So you're sitting there thinking, he wants people to really enjoy life, but then he poisons hospital orderlies and wants them to kill the loved ones of people that are in the games. And Jigsaw, but the thing is, his ideology is wildly all over the place, but he's quite consistent throughout. And I like that.
He's consistent but transformative.
Yeah, exactly. And I like that his apprentices, I'm sorry, Dr. Lawrence Gordon's the only one who plays the game perfectly. I mean, in the first one, he fails the game, but he still saws off his foot. He shoots at him. Then he cauterizes his wound. Then he gets healed up, and he's not all like, Jigsaw, I hate you. You know, he's not like Simone from Saw 6 who hacks off her arm, and she's like, Jigsaw sucks. Like, that dude's, screw that dude. What lesson did I learn? I love her, by the way. And then he helps him out with medical procedures, in 2 with the eyeball, with the Venus flytrap, then with Art, with sewing the mouth shut. And at the end, he kidnaps Hoffman.
Of course, we don't learn that stuff until 7, right? It's around 7 that we learn that he was involved the whole time.
And then he kidnaps Hoffman after Hoffman kills Jill Kramer, John Kramer's wife. But the problem is, Jill Kramer was supposed to test apprentice Mark Hoffman, but she cheated. Hoffman lived, then he killed her by cheating. And then Lawrence Gordon comes out, kidnaps him, and he's still alive. But then you have Amanda Young, who, former addict, and she gets really jealous with actually Hoffman was the first. Actually, Logan was the first. But then Hoffman, Amanda Young is like, nobody changes, and she gets mad, but she gets blackmailed from Hoffman because Cecil murdered Jill Kramer's, led to Jill Kramer's baby's death, so he blackmailed her with that, and then she shot the doctor from the 3rd one. And she's like, nobody changes, so she's under stress. And then she dies. She fails her game. And then Hoffman was blackmailed into it the whole time, so he could care less about Jigsaw's ideology. He just wanted to murder people. And then Jill Kramer cheats, actually, by trying to kill him. And so Jigsaw's ideology, for me, I think he knows Amanda's a failure. He knows Hoffman's a failure. I think he just wants copycats. I think he wants this out there that if you can survive these things, your life is better. And you're right though, his ideology though, it's like, hey, I'm gonna murder your family if you don't enjoy life. Oh, thanks, Jigsaw. That's awesome. And there are traps that you can't do because Amanda Young rigs them to die. It's Jigsaw's ideology is a madman's ideology, but I like how it's relatively consistent throughout.
Right.
And I like that about him.
Yeah, because even as we see people dying, or we have him have apprentice X test apprentice Y, etc. I think it was most elegantly presented as he saw Amanda's decline. Because when he was doing his kind of, it almost feels like a soliloquy sometimes when he has his little monologues. Like when he was talking about it, he was like, you could tell that it pained him that he hoped so much for her, but her frailty led to her jealousy. And that led to her bringing these traps the way that she did, and her demands that no one would change because she was drawn back to her previous addiction, right, that he had saved her from. But I think it really hurt him. I think in a fatherly way, he was very disappointed that she failed, and that I feel like he's pulling, like a Ned Stark, where it's like, yeah, but I've got to execute this because I'm judge and jury as well.
Yeah, and she was blackmailed too, which makes it even worse, like more sad when you realize that. It's just such a funky little. That's the thing though. For me, I recently wrote a post, a top 10 horror franchise by the numbers, and the tomato meter average for the Saw films is 28.5, but the audience average is 64.1 million. And I also like, though, these movies, all 8 of them, I haven't, excluding Spiral, their budgets were $9 million on average, and they averaged $75 million domestic.
Oh, they're pleasers.
Yeah.
I mean,
and there's an audience, right? So critics, do you know what I like about this? Sorry to interrupt, John. Like, you know what I like is, I love critic-proof franchises sometimes. Mm-hmm. I like that there's Resident Evil's kicking around, Final Destination's kicking around, Underworld's kicking around, where only maybe one of them between, I think only Final Destination 5 might be fresh, but all of them made money, and they are quite connected as well. And I think I just think Saw, there's a place for it because it does something that it didn't have to. And it could have just gone, John and his I don't know, and his bros are out at a brewery weekend. They get kidnapped by Jigsaw, and Jigsaw's like, you don't live your life. You should be in California drinking IPAs, but instead you're in Vermont drinking IPAs. And you're like,
drinking hazies. Yeah. You should be going piney.
Yeah. He's like, don't you know that West Coast is better? And you're like, well, that's subjective, Jigsaw. And Jigsaw's like, how dare you? So you have to get put in traps where, you get beer dunked on your head and you have to stab yourself in the neck with a pen like Strom. That was like my favorite moment of the franchise, by the way. Most gangster moment.
The choice that I never had to choose piney West Coast IPAs.
and you three just get wiped out. And then the fourth one is a bunch of West Coast IPA drinkers because Jigsaw realized that Vermont IPAs are delicious. And now he's like, well, I was wrong. So now you West Coast IPA drinkers, you should be in Vermont.
You saw what was trending on Untapped.
Yeah. And so the next one's in Atlanta. Like, have you tried Wild Leap? You're drinking Pliny. You're drinking Treehouse. You should be drinking Wild Leap. And each
Pliny
movie
is so 2017.
Alpha abstraction. And so he's just, it could be him just murdering different groups each film and then going on to the next town. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah.
But instead, you get flashbacks, callbacks, bringbacks, whatbacks, I don't know, camelbacks. Like, it's just a lot of reoccurring characters that pop up through the franchise. There's a lot of, they wrote a full story as opposed to just murdering West Coast IPA drinkers every movie.
Something else that's neat is that this franchise